Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to Product Footprint Live. This is our second product footprint session. We hosted our first of these back in April. Hopefully some of you will have seen that, but if not, we'll make some reference to that and give everybody the opportunity to go back and watch the session from April as well. About today, my name is Dan Hill-Morris. I'm the head of sales here at Carbon Footprint, and I am joined by my colleague Tom Vaughan, who's one of our more senior consultants and specialized in product footprinting. So
we'll start off with the latest legislation. We touched on this on the last product live in April. So there'll be links to that video, so you can refresh yourselves with all the latest legislation. And then we'll go into why you'd want to do a product footprint, what the advantages are to your business, and then quickly look at how to measure footprints and the different methods of doing so, and how to decide what method's best for you. And then reducing your emissions. So once you've assessed your footprint, how you can use that data to look at hotspots, and then the carbon compensation of that, and making sure you offset all those emissions you've created. And then we'll look at how you can embed the cost of that into your pricing.
yeah, so lots of really crucial stuff there. We're going to be, of course, focusing largely on why we want to be doing this, taking this. I think you'll remember the session in April was very much leaning into the how to, but this is all about why is it so important, and why is it such a commercial benefit to all of you as well to be looking at your products in this way. Before we dive in, though, hopefully plenty of you have scanned that QR code and taken the poll and had a look at those few questions that we have for you. So we asked a few questions. Have you measured any of your products' carbon emissions yet? Some of you have. Some of you planning to in the not too distant future. So yeah, hopefully there's going to be plenty here for all of you, both in terms of understanding what you can now do with that information that you've already done, or how you're going to go about achieving that in the next 6 months, as it suggests here. Primary interest in, more answers. Primary interest in carbon footprinting here.
It's quite a spread. It's quite interesting. There's not just one reason.
The disclosure to customers and supply chain is interesting, and we'll definitely be touching on that today and why that's important, and seeing some of the benefits of comparisons to competitors as well. So that's good. What do you use currently? Lots of people on spreadsheets, Tom.
Yeah, the go-to method, simple. It's quite small people on software, not many.
Yeah, it is an option, but can be quite costly, can't it? Let's see how we're doing down here. Oh, this is interesting. So lots of you are exporting your products, so or plan to. So yeah, we'll be touching on. There'll definitely be some interesting information in today's session for you on that. Oh, the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. This is people either know or they don't know. Look at that. That's something to touch on perhaps later. And mostly physical products today. So let's look at the latest legislation, as we talked about, updates in that and the best practices for product carbon footprint disclosure today in 2025. As I mentioned earlier, or as Tom mentioned there during the when we were looking at the agenda, we did touch on this in our last session, so we will sort of point back to that in a second. But there are a few things just to make sure everybody does have front and center. ESPR is one of those. Tom, remind us, what is ESPR?
Yeah, so it's legislation from the EU. It's quite recent, so since 2024. And it basically encourages you to design your products so that they're more sustainable, so might be more easily repaired, more sustainable materials, and they're introducing a digital product passport, which is interesting. So once you've assessed your product, so you've done a product carbon footprint, you can then disclose that information in this digital passport that customers can look at and see. It allows transparency, basically.
Okay, so this digital product passport is ultimately going to be something that the EU wants to see on all products, and it will help consumers make more informed decisions about the climate impact of their purchases. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And all this legislation, this is one of the reasons why you might have to do a product footprint or encouraged to do one, is the EU are quite hot on introducing all these different legislations.
That's certainly true, because a lot of what we're talking about here is specifically EU related. But we noticed, of course, that a lot of our customers and a lot of our delegates here are, in fact, selling goods into the EU. So it is important to note and to be on top of for those European customer businesses. And the ESRS piece here for CSRD is no different, is it?
Yeah, this is also more for organizational footprint. So you've got your scope 1, 2, and 3, and the scope 3, which they want you to disclose. So these are emissions from all your purchased goods and services. So as a company, to assess that, if you're buying products from your supplier might be asked to do a product carbon footprint for these for the customers.
So to everybody here today, if your European customers are looking for an accurate scope 3 assessment, then understanding your product's carbon footprints is going to be beneficial to them and potentially a competitive edge in that regard.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Sticking in Europe for a moment, we've also got CBAM. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, again touched on in the last session. This is the mechanic to close the loophole in the existing ETS that is found from importing goods, essentially. So once again, European companies being asked to report on, and from next year being charged for the import of certain goods. These are certain carbon intensive goods at this time. Yes.
Yes, and one thing to mention that was announced a few months ago now. The UK have their own version of CBAM, but they've made it compatible with the EU CBAM. So they're pretty much matched up just to make things easier. But they're starting with
excellent.
more carbon intensive goods, rolling out goods that use a lot of cement, iron, steel, aluminium, all these carbon intensive materials first.
Yep. But so reporting on these, and then obviously in the future expanding that to eventually be reporting on everything. But again, your customers in the EU, or as Tom says, potentially even if you're exporting to the UK, that the same sort of rules will apply. Funnily, there is an act currently in Congress in the US, which is they've called the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, FPFA, and that also is something of a carbon copy, pun intended, of CBAM. So again, looking at the very carbon-intensive products of steel, aluminium, cement, etc., to start with, but will eventually expand to more, and it will look at imposing taxes or tariffs on imports of these products specifically from a climate perspective. So this is happening globally. You know, more and more countries, the EU, the UK, the US now all looking at this import-export piece, and so the more exporting that you do, the more likely it is to become pretty important that you have a good understanding of your product footprints and you have accurate data to report with to those customers. We touched on UK reporting last time, and we've got the QR code here that will let you just revisit the previous session from April. Not to dwell on this piece, but as Tom says, the UK is moving as well. So currently our SECR doesn't look for that full mandatory Scope 3 reporting like the CSRD in the EU does, but they are making noises about moving in that direction, and they want to bring it in line as soon as possible. So again, your product carbon footprints are going to be pretty important in terms of determining your customers' Scope 3 emissions for their mandatory reporting, and they're going to need to know that information. As I say, QR code there, so please do go and revisit the video from April. You'll see there's a bit more information about what's required and other thoughts of best practices. But on the best practice front, we should touch on the ISO standard 14067. So if you're somebody who is thinking about assessing the footprint of your products, looking at getting this done for your products, certainly this is the way to go. Tom, why is 14067 so important?
Well, it's basically universally recognized. It's the standard for product carbon footprints. So basically, it's got a standard layout. So you look at the raw material, the embodied emissions of the raw materials, the manufacturing, so all the electricity and fuels used, transport and distribution. So this is what's known as cradle to gate. So finishing at the factory gate, and then there's cradle to grave, which also is a larger scope, so includes the use phase, so the energy or fuel used, if that's relevant, and the disposal of the product. And there's different reasons to choose cradle to gate or cradle to grave, depending on what's required and what data you have available.
But regardless of whether it's to the gate or to the grave, Tom, what we're saying is that the ISO here, the 14067, is the internationally recognized standard, and I think that's what gives the work credibility. So whether you're making these calculations yourself in-house and then seeking for a third party to verify or looking for that third party assurance on your calculations, or whether you're having somebody undertake this work for you, this is the standard to work to, because it is so established and so widely recognized that certainly when you reflect on some of that legislation, when you're talking about reporting for the EU's various requirements or other various requirements that we've talked about, you know that with the adherence to the ISO standard, you're certainly meeting all of the requirements that are going to be needed of you. Which brings us up to speed, I think, with the legislation and the best practice. That's what we have to touch on there. As I mentioned, do go and take a look at the video in April for a little bit more information there. But what we really wanted to get into today was some of the business cases. We want to share with you, of course, as we talked about last time, there are lots of reasons to look at a product carbon footprint, the environmental benefits and the business benefits. We talked about that in our last video. So do go and have a look at that. But today we're going to actually look at some very real case examples of other organizations who have taken this approach and clearly seen some success with it. So looking at those business benefits, that brand reputation, that competitive edge, the increasing consumer demand that we're all hearing about, what does that actually mean in the real world? So the first example we have for you here is Oatly. I'm sure we've all heard of Oatly, oat milk products. They are very popular, very successful brand of oat milk products. They have taken the position to actually print their carbon footprint of their products on the side of their cartons there. Interesting, Tom, that they've been able to consistently show that they are significantly lower than cow's milk, and they're proudly displaying that on their packaging, very transparent.
Yeah, I find it interesting for the average consumer if they'd know if 0.38 kilograms of CO2 is good. I think as more products display this carbon label, more consumers will be able to tell the difference of what is a more sustainable product. So definitely having a comparison to milk in this example makes it a lot more clearer, I think.
This is true, because I don't think I've ever seen the same sort of badge on a carton of cow's milk telling us what's there. But that transparency is really engages their customers. I think that's what they look for, that behavioral shift for their consumers, and actually has also led to a bit of an accolade. They've been recognized as a climate solutions company, so another feather in their cap, something for their sustainability pages, and something that has led to their very clear success in recent years. We also wanted to talk about Lupin Healthcare. Now, Lupin are an interesting case because the motivation here is slightly different. Their motivation is largely driven. I wouldn't go as far as to say entirely driven, but certainly is very largely driven by their customers' requirements specifically. So for anyone who doesn't know, Lupin make respiratory health products, inhalers and similar. And of course, they supply into the NHS. So adhering to and getting themselves in line with the NHS net zero supplier roadmap has been the key driver for Lupin here, who have gone the whole hog, Tom, cradle to grave. So this included the use and end of life of the products, didn't it?
Yeah, so the NHS are very keen. So if you supply your product to the NHS, you have to get it carbon assessed. And in this case, what Lupin found was there was a huge hotspot, which was the propellant used. So it had a global warming potential, kind of 200, 300 times more potent than CO2. And it made up about 90% of the overall emissions. So what they are looking to do now is replace this repellent with a near zero global warming potential one, and it's just a quick and easy way of drastically reducing these emissions.
No, and that is really good to see as well. So we've got an organisation who have gone and followed this process because the NHS required it, and then as a result, they've actually found something that they can do about it, and they've made a commitment to go ahead and do that, which is amazing. And of course, the NHS aren't the only organisation who are being so demanding. So increasingly more and more large organizations, institutions are insisting on this sort of detail from their suppliers. So all the more reason to be looking at assessing and compensating for your products. The last example we have here is the cheeky panda. Slightly more light-hearted as we sit and talk about bamboo toilet roll, but I'm sure we've all seen these stacked up in our supermarkets, looking at potential alternatives to the traditional once again. This is a fantastic example because their assessments managed to demonstrate 45% less carbon than the average for normal recycled toilet paper, which they present themselves publicly in their own case study. For their commercial operations, their business to business side, by switching to the cheeky panda, the oval cricket ground there reduced their footprint by 22 tons. So once again, we're talking about your customers and the impact on their scope 3 emissions. So, somebody like the oval cricket ground, Tom, when they're reporting on their carbon footprint, they want to encompass their full scope operationally, including scope 3. That includes their purchased goods and services, which includes their toilet paper. Yes?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure toilet paper is quite a small part of their overall footprint, but
I'm sure it is, but every little helps.
exactly, yeah. If they can scale that up to some of their biggest suppliers and choose a more sustainable alternative, then because scope 3 makes up an organization's it's like 90% of their overall emissions is their scope 3. So it's definitely one to focus on.
It certainly is. And also, similar to Lupin's output, we also know that the results from the exercise from the product footprinting of the toilet roll here highlighted some hotspots, didn't it, Tom? And we Cheeky Panda have made a move to take some of their manufacturing operations to bring that to the UK just to reduce the transportation emissions, which actually contributed to a higher EcoVadis sustainability rating for them.
Yeah, it's a good thing about getting your product assessed. So every 2 years you do a reassessment, and hopefully you can see that you've taken action on these hotspots, and every 2 years you'll see your product reduce emissions even further.
So there's some great examples of organizations, products, brands even that have used this information to their advantage, that have gone about this the right way. They've understood why this is important, presented that data credibly with integrity, as well as that gone ahead and compensated those emissions. So for those case examples we've just looked at, we also know that the compensation is in place and those emissions are being accounted for through offsetting as well. So how do we do this? What's the best approach to do this? Well, again, we did touch on this in some detail on the last video. So of course, please do revisit the video from April. But the headlines are here. Tom, what's the way to choose how we approach this?
Yeah, again, so this is following that ISO 14067 standard. So first of all, you want to select the scope, so either cradle to gate or cradle to grave. This would depend on what your requirements are. If your customers are asking cradle to grave, you can do that. It also depends on how available the data is. It's not always simple to collect data on disposal. You have to make a lot of estimations on how your customers dispose the product. Once you've decided that, there's a few different methods of assessing your footprint. So you can do it DIY or in-house on Excel spreadsheets. This would be ideal if you've got quite a simple product with just a few materials. You can access emission factors online, do a few spreadsheet calculations, and then you'd want to get those calculations verified by a third-party consultant, so you know it's all correct and accurate. So yeah, there's no reason you can't do it in-house. Another method is consultant-led approach. So you'd provide the data to your consultant, they'd do all the calculations, they have access to all these different databases on the emission factors, and it will be verified as well. So if you've got a slightly more complex product with a lot more suppliers, it's definitely the one to choose.
I think for those first two options, again, just keeping that in line with the ISO 14067, really key to emphasize that if you're doing this yourself and making your own calculations, the third-party verification or third-party assurance of that is really important to make sure you've had that undertaken. And B, if you do go with down the consultant-led road, be confident and comfortable that they are adhering to the ISO standard for that piece of work.
Yeah, definitely. And then lastly, you can do a software-led. So there's different platforms, often quite expensive, and they're more for more complex products. So if you're assessing a computer or a car with lots of different components, and they'd also, that's more for a full LCA, so not just the carbon side, but other components of a full
the whole
LCA.
Environmental suite, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of then, we touched on this during the poll. We talked about there being tangible and physical goods and intangible or virtual goods. Does that change the approach to how we look at an assessment?
Yeah, so as in the survey result, most of you did have or are looking to assess tangible products. So in the last product live, we did an example of a wine bottle. So you'd follow that ISO standard. You'd look at the embodied materials. So here are examples like cars, smartphones, clothing. And these are more looking at the emissions associated with extracting materials and using them and disposing them. But you can also assess intangible products and services. So, for example, cloud storage, if it's more sort of consultancy based, there are ways of basically assessing the energy consumption required. So if you're using data centers, if you're video calling, you can still assess the footprint. It's just in a slightly different way. It's more indirect, but it's still something you can definitely do.
And even financial products, things like loans and mortgages have factors associated with the emissions tied to the investments, etc., don't they? So it's all those, even those sort of very intangible, traditional products are something that can be assessed, if not in quite the same way as the physical products would be. So as Tom mentioned, we did look at a wine bottle example in the last video. So again, do go and take a look at that video from April. For physical products, you'll see a very clear example laid out of how to sort of approach that sort of activity. This time though, Tom, you've got a slightly different example to share, haven't we?
Yeah, so this is an event, so a hybrid corporate event held somewhere in Europe. So what we did is we assessed the guest activities at all the travel. So some guests flew there, took the train, all the hotel accommodation. I think it was an event around for 3 days. And we also looked at the catering for the guests, so what sort of food they're eating, and the embodied emissions of that food. We also looked at the physical venues, so the building the event was held in, how many kilowatt hours was consumed for the duration of the event, so heating, lighting. And then interestingly, we also looked at the virtual component. So a lot of it was video stream, people attended by video call, so Teams and Zoom. And we calculated the emissions associated with powering laptops, the data transmission, and things like that. And then we found, so the total emissions were around 32 tons for a 3-day event of 55 people. And most of those emissions, so a majority of those emissions, were guest travel, so getting to that event. So flights obviously are very carbon intensive, and rail and taxi. Interestingly, I thought virtual event emissions, so laptops and being on Teams and Zoom, are actually higher than I thought, compared to just the physical powering of the building that was held in. But you can see there is a big hotspot, and that is guest travel. So for the next event, it's trying to get people, well, not to fly, move onto that virtual event space if they can.
Well, what's interesting is so just framing this in the context of a product, because we're here talking about products. So if your business is an event manager, event planner, event organizer, and your product is such an event, then actually this insight really helps you in a couple of different ways. One, of course, is that you get to compensate all of those emissions. So the idea that you can present the product as carbon balanced, that you can assure all of your customers, delegates, that the emissions are going to be accounted for, calculated and accounted for. They can, of course, encourage the travel piece, because you're right, it is very interesting that the virtual emissions seem to be higher than those of the physical event. But certainly, given what we can see on the screen there, it would still be far preferable to encourage more people to attend online and fewer people to get on a plane. And all of that, it helps to build their brand, their reputation. It helps to reinforce their own values to their customer base, and to help them understand that they are a sustainable choice. And as we've talked about before, customers are more and more inclined to choose the sustainable choice. And of course, disclosure, Tom.
Yeah. So once you've assessed your emissions, you've got it verified, certified by a third party. You want to use those results, right, and make sure you disclose your emissions to customers, be as transparent as you can. You can use green claims, just be open and transparent, and make sure you tell them, like, we've assessed the full cradle to grave or cradle to gate, what was included. Yeah, definitely use it to back up green claims. You shouldn't be green hushing. It's just being transparent. There's no need to be.
Once again, we've got a QR on the screen there. We don't want a QR overload for all of you out there, but there's so much information that is available to you. So the CADI Live, the Carbon Database Initiative Live session from a few months ago, is well worth a watch. Talks about disclosure and the importance of that, and how easy it is to do, of course. So do take a look at that if you get a moment as well.
And I was just going to say, it's important to reassess those emissions. So every 2 years, so every year the emission factors get updated. So as the grid gets greener, especially in the UK, you'll hopefully see your emissions naturally decline just in electricity use alone.
Yeah, this is true, because even if your own processes and materials haven't changed in 2 years, the world has changed around you. So it's entirely possible that there's been a reduction in that footprint. So it's well worth looking at every couple of years at least. So we want to talk about reducing and compensation. This is the really important part. Once we know what the number is, what do we do with that information? There are kind of two sides to that. One is what's the plan going forward in terms of that reduction, and how do we implement that into a product? And two is, of course, what do we do about all the emissions that have already been caused manufacturing the product to date? So it's fair to say we've got a couple of slides here for you that are top level recommendations, if you like, but I think you will probably find these in 9 out of 10 product carbon footprint or LCA reports in terms of recommendations about what to do next. They're going to suggest that you look at product design and manufacturing, as in sustainable materials, longevity, recyclability, electrifying the operations, all of the headline stuff. This is again quite closely aligned to that ESPR piece, Tom, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's all about designing the product, I'd say, to use. So a lot of tangible products, a lot of their emissions are lying in those materials, the embodied materials. So if you can switch out carbon intensive, I don't know, steel is a good example, switching it to a less carbon intensive material, that will alone reduce emissions.
Significant drops.
Yeah.
Significant drops. And again, the length of use when you're talking about less product going to landfill, recyclability, and electrifying operations is a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? If taking your manufacturing facilities and putting them onto a 100% renewable electricity tariff is going to make a dent in the results, right?
Yeah, and moving supplies that are more local to your factory, so there's less transportation from supplies to your factory.
Well, yes, that's in fact the very next piece. So the other advice that we're pretty confident any LCA or carbon footprint report will give you will be to look at your supply chain and logistics. We talked about scope 3 emissions for your customers and supply chain from their perspective and why it's so important to them. It's equally important to you. And just as your customers are making these demands of you supplying a product, you should also be making these demands of your suppliers supplying your materials and components. So yeah, looking at local suppliers, looking at electric fleets, working with those suppliers in ways that will help to reduce emissions on both sides, I think. And last but not least, on the advice front, we've got the piece around circular economy. So not to sound like a broken record, but reduce, reuse, recycle. Pretty sure everybody's heard that phrase by now. Buyback programs, repairability. Why are these things important, Tom?
So it's all about encouraging a longer lifespan of a product. So if people are using them longer, they're not buying new products. It's just consuming less overall.
Less virgin material, less extraction, lower emissions. That's exactly what we're looking for. So, and all of these things can be looked at and addressed and strategized and planned out. They might not be things that can be changed overnight. Maybe you can't change these things tomorrow or next week, but certainly, in the development roadmap of your products, they're all things that can be looked at in the future. Whilst we're doing that, the other really important piece, of course, is compensating for those emissions that are being caused today. All of the calculations that have just been made to assess that product, that is emissions that are already out there. They're in the atmosphere, and they need to be addressed. And again, I think your customers, be they consumers or be they other businesses who are concerned with their own scope 3 results, will be keen to know that as well as assessing your footprint, and as well as having a plan in place to reduce your footprint, you've also gone ahead and addressed all of those emissions that have been caused already and compensated for that. Otherwise, as it says here, we're just leaving our rubbish outside whilst promising to make less mess next time. That's not what we want to do. We definitely want to make less mess next time, but we also want to get ahead and clear up the rubbish that we've already caused, which brings us on to compensation. Now, there's a lot to talk about with carbon offsetting and compensation. So we will again refer you back to a couple of other videos. We touched on this in the last product video. There is also another QR code coming up in just a second for a video on voluntary carbon market, carbon offsetting, and how that all works and the best practice. What you'll see there is the importance of looking at very specific criteria around additionality, permanence, measurability, and leakage, looking for reputed, credible standards. Integrity and quality are really, really key. And as long as you can provide all of that, then actually you can offset with some confidence, use that to compensate for all of the emissions associated with your product, and very clearly state in your public communications, in your sustainability pages, on your product labels even, that carbon has been accounted for. Ways to do that, of course, are to go ahead and check out the carbon offset marketplace. Transparency here is really the biggest benefit, because you've got a platform which is free to use, wide selection of high integrity carbon projects, as it says here. The price of the units openly displayed, the details of the project openly displayed, immediate evidence of retirement for your audit and assurance. Everything is right there, visible, nothing hidden. We've got the QR code there to go and revisit the carbon offsetting best practice event. There is a lot more detail in that session about what makes a good carbon offset project, what you're looking for in terms of standards, in terms of criteria for your project. But platforms like the carbon offset marketplace here can certainly help you to do that. Similarly, the Carbon Ratings Insight platform, or CRISP, again, free to use, free to view. There's no paywalls, there's nothing hidden here, and you've got clear ratings against all of those key criteria that we talk about. Are the projects meeting the additionality criteria, permanence, measurability, leakage, etc. CRISP also highlights the project's ICVCM status, their current ICVCM status. That's the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And of course, with that in mind, and with all of the other criteria that we've talked about, you can make a really well-informed decision about the quality of the projects that you're supporting, the integrity of the projects that you're supporting, and again, communicate them with confidence on your sustainability pages to your customers and your labels about the offsetting that's occurred, and the fact that the emissions associated with your product have all been accounted for. I do recommend that other video there, the best practice carbon offsetting video, the voluntary carbon market video. It does have a lot of detail around what makes good offsetting. What's really important, though, is that we do. So it is not just about measuring and reducing going forwards, it's also about accounting for everything that's been caused, as has been demonstrated by the examples we talked about, the business case examples, in fact, of looping with the NHS of the good role, not the good role, sorry, Cheeky Panda there, and Oatly. So last but not least, we want to touch on how do you make that work, building all of that into your cost and pricing models. You've already got your business, you've got your product, and there's going to be a need to undertake all of this work and to look at the assessment and the compensation. So where does that all fit? Well, this is a very, very simple story to tell. We've got just one slide for you here. These are all very real examples. So these are actually customers of ours that we've anonymized here, but they are very real, very genuine examples. For the sake of this exercise, let's call them small, medium, and large. We've got an FMCG product there at £1.50, a pretty standard household product that retails at about £25, and then a more high-end tech product that retails at about £400. And you can see in the tables here, I'm not just going to read these to you. You can all see that on the screen quite clearly. But you can see we've put in, the cost to have that product assessment, what the result of that assessment was, which is very small figures. That's presented in tons of carbon, of course, and in most cases, these products are mere kilograms or even grams of carbon per product. So we're talking about some very small numbers. We're talking about how many of these units are anticipated to be sold each year against their retail price, and what does that mean in terms of revenue. You can see very, very clearly that actually the cost of assessing the product, just a fraction, 0.03 or less % of the retail price. And even with a very conservative budget to offset for the compensation, so conservative budget of about, let's say, £10 per tonne in this example, again, fractions of the cost. So whilst there is, of course, a climbing scale here, at the lower end, overall, the cost to assess and compensate those emissions for our £1.50 product has been 0.15%, closer to 0.2% for the household product, creeping up to 0.3% there for the tech product. But that it really doesn't ever get much larger. I can tell you that we've worked on, if we think about what the extra large version of this table might look like, we've worked with build projects with a project value of £4 million, and even when you're talking at that sort of size and scale, the number at the bottom of the table here is still only 0.5%, 0.5%. So all of this is something that most organizations, most companies can absorb into their product cost. They can bring that cost in, and it's very, very clear that with it being such an affordable piece of work and so in demand, whether that's about changing legislation that we talked about at the beginning, whether that's about your customers' demand, customers like the NHS or other institutions who are insisting on having this kind of detail from people, or whether this is just consumer demand and the world wanting to make those better choices because they're well informed. The real question kind of becomes, can we really afford not to be doing this? Because clearly it all stacks up. And that is our last piece of presentation. So we have touched on all of these items today, like we said. We've looked at the latest legislation. We've glanced at some business cases with Oatly and with the Cheeky Panda and with Loop in there. We've talked about how to approach this, what's the best way to do this. The reducing and compensation, really, really important part to balance those two hand in hand there, the plan going forward, as well as accounting for everything that's already happened. And then what does that look like in terms of cost and pricing? Well, it's sort of, I think, becomes a no-brainer. It's definitely something that needs to be looked at for pretty much any product going to market today. After today, then, what we want to have all of you thinking about is deciding to make product footprinting a part of your own sustainability strategy. jump on this train? Where are we going to kick that off? What's your top seller? Your widest product range? Where's going to be the best place to start? Engage with somebody to determine the best approach, whether that's internally or externally. Look at who's going to be owning this piece of work for you. Make sure that everything you do is definitely adhering to recognized standards. Look at the ISO 14067, or ensure that whoever you're engaged with is looking at the ISO 14067. And then measure those benefits in your own business. Create your own cost models. Make sure that your compensation and reduction is bearing the same fruit that we saw in those other case studies, and rinse and repeat for sure.
Yeah, it's likely that at some point in the future you're going to have to do some sort of product carbon footprint. So if you can get these processes and procedures in place now, you'll be prepared. We got a few questions.
There are some questions in the chat there, Tom.
Yeah, so Joanne, they resell products from manufacturers, but they struggled to get carbon data from their suppliers. So, and there's no like-for-like products to use. Any suggestions? So yeah, this is always tricky. So not every supplier will have their product footprint available or measured. And it's okay to use estimations. So it's still early days, so a lot of suppliers won't have that data available. But if you can get the raw materials, the kilowatt hours, you can then calculate either through a consultant or do it yourself, the carbon data yourself, even if it does require a few estimations, that's fine. It's not a strict science, and it's better to have a somewhat general idea of your footprint rather than just not doing it at all.
This is true. Although continuing to try to engage with those suppliers, I think, is also really important. And there are tools out there, Joanne, not least of which will be the supply chain engagement tool that we present on CADI, the Carbon Database Initiative. So there is a supply chain tool readily available there that can help with that engagement and calculation and collection of actual data from suppliers.
So we got a question here about companies being under pressure from setting net zero targets and being transparent as possible. Are there any methods or tools that help companies track these net zero targets in the best periodical way?
Yeah, so tracking progress against targets is obviously really important, and I think the answer is certainly yes. There are lots of variations out there, and certainly the question's right. Lots of pressure to set a target and put it out there in the public domain, but tracking it and seeing progress against it, that's not always as obvious or as transparent. I'd refer back to the Carbon Database Initiative, full, free to use, free to view, public disclosure available there. So certainly, as well as publishing and disclosing all of that carbon data, you're able to track progress, you'll be able to track the direction of travel of your carbon emissions, and certainly share there the achievements that are being made against those targets, to be able to share with customers or stakeholders alike.
For a company with a high volume of products, say hundreds or thousands of SKUs, what is the best way to assess these without requiring a full LCA for every item?
Well, I think we touched on that in that last video in April as well, didn't we? With the idea of having a tool or a calculator that is tailored to the product or the range of products that the company has. Is that right?
Yeah, so if there's slight differences in a product, so for example, just a different color, so it'll have a slightly different pigment, that's completely okay. You can group those products as one product because it's not going to go in, it's not going to be a drastic change in the overall emissions. But there are tools where you can select the material components and yeah, basically assess a large volume of products all at once and get them verified. So we've got a question about the EUDR, so the European Union's deforestation regulation, and how that ties in with product footprints.
I think it does tie in indirectly to product footprinting. I think that certainly it's a regulation that you'll want to adhere to, comply with. You'll make sure that if needed, you are taking a look at that. But certainly, avoiding any deforestation is a good thing. It's going to be less carbon emissions. It's going to indirectly impact the footprint of your product. And the flip side of that is you definitely don't want to be associated with any kind of wide deforestation at all, globally or otherwise. So do take a look, yeah, for sure. We are at the hour, so it is 10:30. I would welcome any last minute questions in these dying moments if anybody has them. But I'm sure everybody also has very busy days to get to. So I would like to thank everybody for your time in coming and joining us here today. Do please go and take a look at the Product Footprint Live from April, the first session we did, as well as that both the CADI, the Carbon Database Initiative video, would be a useful watch, as would the video on the voluntary carbon market, the best practice and offsetting. That's definitely a useful watch. Again, I've been Dan. Thanks to Tom as well for hosting with me today, and thank you very much for joining us. And we will hope to see you next time for the next Carbon Footprint Live event.